Good day. Today I want to talk about in this video why relations between India and China will continue to dip with little hope of redemption this year, and why the possibility of a war in favor of China is very much a possibility and very soon. Let me start this by my two observations that I made at the recently concluded India's largest air show, Aero India 23. Now there the Americans brought for the first time their largest ever defense delegation to this air show, Aero India. And the chief of mission of the Americans, Elizabeth Jones, made it very clear that we are here in support of India, and India, as we know, is part of the Indo Pacific strategy, completely embedded in the US Indo Pacific strategy, which nobody talks about, is actually directed against China. And the second observation is that she profusely spoke about supporting India's presidency this year of G20. G20 is a routine and a rotational post. Last year the presidency was with Indonesia, the next year it will pass on to Brazil. So what was the need for Elizabeth Jones to actually emphasize that we support this presidency? But there was a need, and this is precisely I will explain. So I will connect these three dots: her emphasis on the G20 presidency of India, then her speaking about the Indo-Pacific strategy where India is a partner, and the third thing, the deteriorating Indo-China relations. Now let me start with India-China relations. Please listen in to what the External Affairs Minister has to say about that.
You all know that today the state of our relations with China are not normal. They are not normal because we will not agree to any attempt to change the line of actual control unilaterally.
What Jay Shankar is saying is that relations between the two countries are not normal, primarily because of the border issue. And India will not agree to change of line of actual control unilaterally. The problem is Jay Shankar is being short on truth. Because 3 years back, he himself accepted the change of the line of actual control unilaterally. India accepted that. Now, to understand that, please step back to 15th of June 2020 when the Galwan killings happened. This was the first time without firing a shot. Killings happened where India lost 20 soldiers. The Chinese say they lost 4, and a large number of Indian troops were taken prisoner of war by China, something that the Indian side does not concede, but of course they were released by the Chinese. This shocked the Prime Minister a lot. So much so that within 4 days of the Galwan killing on the 19th of June 2020, Prime Minister made a shocking statement to the nation where he said, nobody has come inside our territory, nobody is sitting inside our territory. Now, there was China very thrilled about hearing this statement for two reasons. One, the Prime Minister of India had accepted the 1959 claim line by saying that nobody has come and nobody is sitting in our territory, whereas the factual thing on the ground as reported by the media was that the PLA in April-May came and occupied something like 2,000 square kilometers of Indian territory in eastern Ladakh. So that was one, it was clear to them. And the second thing what was clear to them was that Prime Minister at the highest level India, through its Prime Minister, had thrown in the towel. It simply did not have the political determination for the fight. In other words, the deterrence of India was zero. Let me please sidestep to explain what is deterrence. Deterrence is important to understand. Deterrence has two components. It comprises of military power, and the second component is political determination. Now in political power, most of us would know, It has again three verticals. It is about technology, which is the capability. In capability, it is no secret that the PLA is way ahead of the Indian military. The second thing is war concepts. Now, how do you optimize that technology or the capability for best results? Here, everybody again knows that while the Indian military is still working on the war concepts which are as old as the year 1986, the American concept called air-land battle. They are still using those war concepts. The PLA is at the cutting edge of war concept, and it is in a competition, a military competition with the US military. And the third component of military power is capacity. Without an indigenous defense production, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine-Russia war, it is impossible to fight a war, even a short war, because you will always be aware that if you do not have a defense industrial complex, that you cannot really fight with the gusto that you wish to, with all the capabilities that you have. So, our military strength, military power in any case was less, and now we have the political determination where it amounted to zero as far as the Chinese was concerned. So, the sum total of this was zero deterrence on the ground. Now, this is nothing new. Again, let me just sidestep. The previous BJP government did the same thing. They did Operation Parakram in 2001, where if you go by the report, something like 2,000 soldiers were killed without a shot being fired. And when the things actually came to the crux in May of 2002, then we had the National Security Advisor of the Vajpayee government, Brijesh Mishra, ringing up the counterpart in US to say, please do something and avoid the war. So, here we had the Prime Minister more, I would say, sensible than the Vajpayee, regime, where he did not even go to war. So, you have zero deterrence. So, the consequences of this were very clear. The consequence was that both the sides in Moscow, with help from the Russians, signed the joint statement on 10th of September 2020. Jay Shankar signed for the Indian side, and Wang He, his counterpart, from the Chinese side. Now, this joint statement was meant to normalize the relations. Both sides had agreed, and if you ask me frankly, or ask any discerning observer, this joint statement was a de facto surrender by India. Why do I say that? Because we accepted on paper, if you read those 5 points of the joint statement, that there will be no status quo ante. Because the Prime Minister had already accepted the Chinese claim line of 1959, so there was no question of going back, the PLA going back. So, de-escalation and de-induction were totally ruled out. And as far as disengagement was concerned, obviously it was to happen on the Chinese terms. So, what the Chinese did was, they ruled out de-escalation at the critical nodes of Depsang and Demchok, and at the other 4 places, on their terms, the demilitarized zone was created, all of it on the Indian side, with the PLA not going back even an inch. This is how the disengagement was done. So, this happened 3 years ago. So, it was now time to implement that. Now, for both sides, and this is why the Chinese keep saying that it is normal. But the problem here was 2 major issues. Number one, once in panic and shock, you sign a thing and then you start thinking what is the implication of that, then you realize that actually you have signed the wrong document because of lack of political determination and military power. So, in India's case, it occurred now to India that in the 2 informal summits, the 2018 summit between the 2 heads of government, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, which was done in Wuhan, cooperation was agreed. And cooperation was agreed under a formula by Prime Minister Modi, and the formula was China India Plus. that both the sides will work together for betterment, for connectivity, for development, for prosperity of South Asian nations. So it would mean China, India, Nepal, China, India, Afghanistan, China, India, Bhutan. It would mean that. The problem here was that given the fact that the Chinese are today perhaps the number one in infrastructure technology and they have deep pockets, if this cooperation was to ever happen, though both the sides, India and China, were cooperating and collaborating, the Chinese side would automatically look like the leader to the third country, which obviously was not acceptable to the Indian government. Now, another promise or the another key thing which was never disclosed by the Indian side to its media, but was disclosed by Wang Yi, who sat through the second informal summit in Chennai in 2019, was that Xi Jinping made it very clear to Prime Minister Modi that there is a need for regional peace. And for regional peace, there should be good relations between India, China, India, Pakistan, and Pakistan, China. Now, this obviously was not acceptable to India for very obvious reasons. So, implementing the what I call the surrender document or the joint statement of 10 September 2020 would mean to cooperate with China in these areas, which obviously was not the correct thing for India to do. And the second problem was that despite having this document being signed 3 years back, all the political leaders have constantly maintained in and out of the parliament that with patience and negotiations, we will get the Chinese to go back to the April 2020 position, knowing fully well that you have signed on the document that their positions are acceptable to us. So, what was the way out? So, the way out thought was that yes, we need to change our foreign policy in a very radical way. And this was done by India, by the Modi government, by signing BECA. BECA is what is called the Basic Exchange and Cooperative Agreement. It is an agreement which is most controversial, most incisive. US Military Foundation Agreement. Once you sign this agreement, that means you are integrated in their deterrence or their military power. And mind you, this agreement was signed not during a normal time. Why it was signed but in panic? Why in panic? Because this agreement was signed in Delhi when the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary of America, they came to India on the 27th October 2021. It was signed then, sorry, 2020, my mistake, apologies, on 2020. And the 3rd of November 2020 were to be the election, the presidential election, the American presidential election. That means in less than a week of America going to the presidential polls, India was rushed to sign this agreement while the Trump presidency was still there. So, once we signed that, Mike Pompeo, who was at that time in the Trump administration, the Secretary of State and who had traveled to India, he writes in his just released memoirs, which is called Never Given an Inch, Fighting for the America I Love. He says, India was actually a wild card in the Quad. India has always charted its own course without a true alliance system. Alliance is a military system. And that is still mostly the case. But China's action of 15th June 2020 in Galwan Valley, this is what I have added. He said, but China's action have caused India to change its strategic posture in the last few years. When you say strategic posture, that means a radical change in your foreign policy. That means it is no longer independent or autonomous foreign policy. Now, let's recapitulate what I have said in two simple sentences. Number one, India, by signing the 10th September 2020 joint statement, which I call the surrender document, conceded zero deterrence against the Chinese. Number two, without the Indian public getting to know or debating this, the fact of the matter is, by signing BECA, and this is precisely what Mike Pompeo also attests, India no longer today has an independent foreign policy. It is aligned with the Americans. And let me explain this now, what this means. What is aligning with the Americans? Now, in this, India signed BECA and of course the three other foundational agreements, again done by the Modi government. It joined American deterrence. Deterrence means military power for Indo Pacific region. Considering, despite the fact that India is not a military ally, India is not even a non-NATO military ally, and it is not also part of the extended deterrence of America. Extended deterrence refers to the nuclear deterrence, the nuclear umbrella that America has in this region for Japan, for South Korea, for Australia and for Philippines. India is not part of that. Despite all that, India goes and signs what now the Biden administration, their defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, he came and said that, look, deterrence has been renamed as integrated deterrence. What is integrated deterrence? It has four verticals, four key verticals, and India is a definitive part of all these verticals, along with their military allies. Now, the first vertical is intelligence gathering. The Americans need intelligence gathering in this entire Indo-Pacific region because this is the arena where great power competition is going on. Because the first thing that Biden administration did was, it made it very clear that they had two challenges as far as strategic issues were concerned. The first challenge was the American geopolitical competition, which was primarily against China, because China is the only nation, they made it very clear, with the capability, capacity, political will to reshape the world order. And hence the competition was in all the fields. It was in economy, it was in politics, it was in technology, it was in military power, it was in diplomacy. And the second challenge they said was, which of course where they wanted the cooperation of the Chinese, because without Chinese cooperation the second thing could not happen. So while they were competing, they wanted cooperation in what is called the shared transnational challenges. They are transnational challenges like climate change, food security, pandemic, energy transition, and all these things. So, when the Biden administration's defense secretary Lloyd Austin said integrated deterrence, as I mentioned earlier, he was talking of four verticals. The first vertical was intelligence gathering for the whole Indo-Pacific region, where now they combined the Quad. India was a part of Quad. The level of the Quad was elevated to the summit level once Biden came there. So Quad, in my assessment, the Chinese rightly called is a mini NATO. That is what it was. So it was Quad, it was the for the maritime domain awareness, it was Quad, then it was Pacific nations, it was Southeast nations, and the entire Indian Ocean region. This whole thing, they wanted intelligence gathering, maritime domain awareness, where India was to play a very prominent role, and it is playing a role in this. This was their first vertical. The second vertical was integrated deterrence, means that because America could no longer generate deterrence on its own, its military power had come down. It was no longer what it used to be during the Cold War. It needed help from the allies. And hence the second vertical is alliances. Now in the alliances there is Quad, there is AUKUS. AUKUS, as we know, is about Australia, UK, US. Submarine nuclear, some nuclear part submarine deal, but it is much more than that. It is basically an arrangement, a military arrangement which encompasses a lot of things. So it was about that. And the other important thing is, a key thing is getting NATO global. One of the things that the Biden administration is doing is NATO, which is a Atlantic alliance, is also now being brought into the Pacific Ocean, which is why for the last meeting, the NATO meeting, countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, they are all military allies of the Americans. They attended the meeting. And now recently we had the Secretary General of NATO visiting all these countries to strengthen, to see the possibilities of how they could together take on China, Chinese growing military power. In fact, it is now put in that document also, NATO document, that China is now a threat as far as they are concerned. It's a big challenge. And in March of this year, which is next month, there is already news that the Director General is supposed to visit India. India is not, as I said, a member of NATO, but a meeting is to be held because India is merely a major defense partner, nothing more than that. But it has already got integrated into their deterrence. The third vertical is, how do you, as a major defense partner, which India is, the American challenge is how to wean away the Indian military from the Russian platforms to the American platform, because this is a critical requirement for interoperability. Which is why at the recent Aero India, in addition to their F-16, which now they have given the name F-21, and their Super Hornet, they also brought in the F-35s fighters and the B-1 bombers, which is a long-range supersonic bomber, which flew in from Guam to participate in the Aero India. Now, there is a senior Air Force officer who actually told me that, look, the Air Force is not considering as part of this 114 that they are looking for the last 5 years, additional aircraft. F-35 is not in the list, we will not consider that. Now, I had to remind him that for God's sake, please understand, since the coming of Modi government, the threats and the capability to meet those threats are being determined by the Prime Minister's office and not by the service headquarters. It is immaterial what you are thinking. I am not saying that the Prime Minister or the PMO will go and buy these, but what I am saying is that this is what is on the offer, and there will certainly be a lot of pressure to develop better interoperability from the American side. And the fourth vertical, as I mentioned, was standardization. Standardization in the critical and emerging technologies. Recently, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval was in Washington, where as part of the understanding already reached between Biden and Modi, he had a discussion with his counterpart on the initiative in critical and energy technologies, where artificial intelligence, cyber, space, standardization, all this was discussed. So what are we talking about when I say all these things? What we are talking about is, as far as America is concerned, India has taken that decisive step of aligning its foreign policy with America. Why I say this is because the strength of America is its deterrence. Military power is the strength of America. America is the only country which has nearly 750 military bases with 200,000 troops in them across the globe. This is their strength. So what they need is, they need India as part of their present platforms, the present capabilities, and they are already building up India to help them or to partner insofar as the Indian Ocean region is concerned, in the emerging technology also, because that is where the warfare is going. In fact, the warfare has already gone there. So these are the four verticals that we are talking about. Now, what do you think the Indians are hoping to get out of this? Two things. Number one, they are hoping that by helping the Americans to be part of their Indo Pacific strategy, which is about a global geopolitical competition being played in the Asia Pacific region with serious and critical implications for the world, India hopes that they will piggyback on the American power for a regional competition with the Chinese, that means in their backyard, what they call the Indian Ocean region. This is one. Now, this is one part, because why this is important is it gives teeth to Modi's Act East policy. Please recall, when he came to power, the first thing he did was, there was an assessment made in the Modi government that there is nothing much, we are blocked in the land borders by Pakistan and China. So the only area where we can have a strategic reach, or we can emerge as one of the poles in a multipolar world, is the Indian Ocean region. So the thinking was, and this is what they did, from look east of the Manmohan Singh government, they made it Act East policy, and they brought in connectivity and hard power into this. And now here was an opportunity to actually give a teeth, piggybacking on the American power, American deterrence, to their Act East policy. But this is not something that the Prime Minister himself is really looking at, for the simple reason it is so opaque. He looks at those challenges which are real and immediate, and for him in my assessment, it is always the elections. So the second benefit comes from the elections, for the elections of 2024, when there is general election. And this is how it will be. When Elizabeth Jones says that we will support India, Modi government, for the G20 presidency, what this means is, and we have heard this, we have heard Jay Shankar, our external affairs minister, saying it repeatedly on television.
When we must become the voice of the global south, countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America trust India to speak up for them. There are very good reasons why today the world is taking a much deeper interest in us. The G20 presidency offers an opportunity to share our story with others, particularly those who may transpose some of our experiences on their performance or challenges. And it is also a time when we must become the voice of the global south.
That why can't India be voice of the global south in G20? In other words, what I mentioned, the second priority of the Americans, the shared transnational challenges, in that they want the American blessings to become the leader in these trans challenges by being the voice of the global south. And as we are aware, something like, it's a very routine thing, but it has been elevated to a high level with a purpose. And the purpose is that something like 300 plus meetings throughout this year have been planned of G20, various things, tourisms and other things are there in that. The whole idea, and of course culminating in the summit, which is in September, the summit of the G20. The whole idea is that at each of these meetings, the Indian delegation will speak about the aspirations of the global south, aspirations of climate change, aspiration of vaccination, of pandemic, how to take on the next pandemic, the food security, energy transition, all these things, digitization will be spoken by India, and India will assume the role with the blessing of America and of course America's partners. this huge role, and this is what will help India project itself during the run up to the 2024 election as a country where the Prime Minister is heard by a committee of nations. He is taken seriously. So this is what the whole thing is about. Now, let's understand a bit about what exactly is Global South. When you say India wants to become, or Jay Shankar repeatedly says we will be the voice of Global South, what is Global South? So, Global South are the third world countries. During the Cold War, as we are aware, there was the first world, the second world, the third world. The first world were the two superpowers. The second world were the NATO and the Warsaw countries, which were aligned with the superpowers. And the third world were the developing and the less developed nations of Latin America, Asia, Africa, Pacific nations, Oceania nations, those 14 nations, all these came under the rubric of the third world. And of course, ASEAN was also part of that, the third world. In Southeast Asia, again there was a division. The ASEAN really was the part of the third world at that time, whereas the developed nations, which is nations like Japan, Korea, Singapore and Taiwan, which were the allies of the Americans, they were not really, they never came in the third world. So the point I am making is, India says that we will be the leader of the Global South. This is the whole thing which is being now projected. Now, this makes the domestic audience very happy, and Americans and the West have no problems in praising India on this score. But the realities are different. Let's consider the realities. The reality is that the Belt and Road of China, which was first spoken of in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and the second part of that was spoken of in 2015, which is the Digital Silk Road, which is about hard and soft cyberspace connectivity, which really translates into the third and the fourth industrial revolution. China has invested billions of dollars in phase one of this, and it has invested all this money in the Global South. All these countries that I spoke about in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, today in ASEAN, just to, if somebody is looking at statistics, despite the differences, despite the land borders, despite the problems in the South China Sea about territorial, grabbing, so-called grabbing, the fact of the matter remains that ASEAN today has, and it is projected to have by 2013, well over $1 trillion worth of trade with China. And by 2030, it will emerge as the fourth largest economy in the world, ASEAN. And China has invested in all this. Not only that, China is supposed to hold their third Belt and Road Forum in this year. This was announced by Xi Jinping himself. And this is where they will talk about the phase two, the Digital Silk Road, which they have already started implementing piecemeal in the ASEAN nations. In all the ASEAN nations for the last 5 years, 5G has been Huawei, 5G has come there. China has created data centers. China has created cloud services have been given there. And so basically the digital infrastructure is already set there. Now it is ready to take it further, and this is something which is likely to be announced at the forum this year by Xi Jinping himself, that we will move away from infrastructure to physical infrastructure to digital infrastructure. Now this is not all. At the United Nations General Assembly in September 2021, Xi Jinping spoke about the Global Development Initiative, where he said the focus must shift away from infrastructure to work on capability building for the Global South. And this was readily accepted by the UN General Secretary for the simple reason that it fulfilled the agenda set by the UN in 2015 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. China has a capability today to fulfill 15 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the United Nations General Secretary accepts this position. Next, in April 22, China came up, Xi Jinping himself spoke about the Global Security Initiative. See, all this Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative are really the offshoots of the Belt and Road, where Chinese are basically taking the whole thing Belt and Road directly to the UN. So, in the Global Security Initiative, they are talking of cooperative security, they are talking of no zero-sum game, and the most important line here is that no country's security should be at the cost of any other country's insecurity. Let me repeat this line, it is important. No country's security should be at the cost of other countries' insecurity. Now, this is where India is a problem area. One of the leading analysts, naval analysts, a former naval chief, well respected, Admiral Arun Prakash. This is what he wrote recently in his one of the books, which is called In Hard Times. According to him, I need to read this quote. There is a school of thought that since Indian Ocean sea lanes of communication constitute China's jugular vein, India must threaten China to exert pressure. And India can threaten China because we dominate both the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, and we sit astride the Strait of Malacca with our Andaman and Nicobar Islands. According to him, commerce raiding is a potent strategy, and once hostilities commence, India could declare certain areas as exclusion zones subject to counterband control, thereby dictating or denying the flow of food, security and trade to China. Please, let's put this in a context. He is not talking in the air. He is a well-known analyst who is basically talking that without saying so, he knows India's naval, maritime and naval capabilities, in that India could do this as part of America's integrated deterrence, the four verticals that I spoke about, and why the Americans are euphoric about it, the whole thing. But what are the consequences? This the Indians are not thinking at this stage. The consequences are very simple. If their Chinese sea lanes of communications are threatened, please understand, and this is for the Indian policy maker and analyst, $4 trillion worth of Chinese commercial trade passes annually between the 3,000 nautical miles between the two choke points of Strait of Malacca and Strait of Hormuz. It comes from Hormuz, from the Mediterranean, travels all along the Indian Ocean region, goes to Strait of Malacca. Now, if India on borrowed military strength decides to threaten that, I mean, you already disclosing what you intend doing, wouldn't the Chinese fight in self-defense? Wouldn't the Chinese preempt this? So, here is the bottom line. There is no turning back for India. A radical shift has happened in the foreign policy by signing the foundational agreements. America wins, India loses. And it is a matter of time before Xi Jinping decides. He has the capabilities in place in the Himalayas. Make no mistakes about it. The capabilities exist for a quick, short, decisive war in China's favor. And I have explained this in my book, The Last War, which came out 6 months ago in August 2020. So, according to their well-known strategy of active defense, that means we will preempt and we will fight on enemy soil. What stops them from finishing, from destroying completely the American Indo Pacific strategy by hitting India? Once India is hit, the whole the Indo Pacific strategy goes for a toss. Think about this. Thank you.